rise of Napoleon Bonaparte was accompanied with a thorough reorganization of his army. I argued in an earlier video that the Battle of Marengo in the year 1800 had considerable impact on his thinking of how the cavalry arm should be reorganized. At Marengo, the regular heavy cavalry units broke the Austrian enemy lines and won the day. This cavalry charge reversed an almost defeat into victory, and he created 12 elite heavy cavalry regiments, specialized in shock chargers, the cuirassiers. Large men with armor on large horses. Their elite status exemplified in that all troopers would wear epaulettes as an indication of their special status. However, it was not only the heavy cavalry that won the day at Marengo. Alongside the heavy troopers, there were dragoons charging into the Austrian ranks. Dragoons were considered medium cavalry, with the size of their horses between the heavy cavalry and the light cavalry. Dragoons were considered infantry on horses, carrying shortened muskets, while equally wielding the large heavy cavalry sword similar as the cuirassiers. Their swords were therefore the heavy thrusting swords suitable for charges, and dragoons were frequently used in this capacity, as was done at Marengo. Dragoons did not have elite status, and as such troopers did not wear any epaulettes on their distinguishable green coats. They were, however, the first cavalry arm that wore cavalry helmets that would equally be adopted by the cuirassiers, and this type of helmet would remain fairly similar until the start of the First World War for both dragoons and cuirassiers. The difference in helmet between the two cavalry types was that the round ball part of the cuirassier helmet was steel-colored with a brass crest, while the dragoon helmets were all brass, a distinction that would remain for dragoons and cuirassiers until the First World War. The duties of dragoons were varied, ranging from charges, which was the specialization of heavy cavalry, being mounted infantry, which was a specialization of the chasseurs au cheval, doing screening duties and reconnaissance, which was a hussar specialization, and as such they were perceived as the versatile arm of the cavalry, used for multiple roles, while expert at none. Napoleon must have been impressed with the performance of the dragoons and their versatility, as the number of regiments was vastly increased during the reorganization, increasing to 30 regiments. There were examples of hussar regiments changing into dragoons, with the colonels complaining about having to purchase heavier horses, as colonels were expected to pay for their own horses. This is a picture from the famous Nuttall series, the famous uniform expert of the 19th century, and it shows dragoons still partially wearing their old hussar uniforms. The 30 uniforms showed very distinctive patterns, using a similar system as I already indicated for cuirassiers in the previous video. The 30 regiments were separated into 5 distinct colors: scarlet red for regiments 1 to 6, crimson red for regiments 7 to 12, 13 to 18 wore pink, 19 to 24 wore yellow, and 25 to regiment 30 wore orange, which each color having 6 different variants for each regiment. Similar as with cuirassiers, per color, the first 3 regiments would wear a jacket with horizontal false pockets on their coats, while the latter 3 regiments per color would wear vertical large false pockets. The 3 regiments with either horizontal or vertical pockets were distinguishable by a variation in neck collar and cuff patterns, and this variation was again systematic. Bear with me. The 1st regiment wore neck collars in the regimental collar, with green collar edging. The 2nd regiment had the neck collar in reverse, with a dragoon green collar and regimental edges, while the 3rd regiment was similar as the 1st, with a neck collar in regimental collar and green dragoon edging. The wrist cuff patterns now created the further distinction. For the 1st regiment, the main cuff and the button section were in regimental colors, with dragoon green edging around them. The 2nd regiment had the main cuff in regimental color and the button section in dragoon green with regimental edging. The 3rd Regiment had a dragoon green main cuff with a regimental edging and the button section in regimental colors with green edging. If you're only listening to this video, you have no idea what I'm talking about. Alright. The officer structure was equally similar as for cuirassiers, with the captain as the main officer for a cavalry squadron, having a silver-laced epaulet on the left shoulder, a leopard-skinned fur around the helmet, as all officers had, and he was issued with an officer's sword, equally for all officers. The captain was held by a 1st and 2nd lieutenant, with similar uniforms only having red stripes on the epaulets, showing their lower rank. 1 stripe for the 1st lieutenant and 2 stripes for the 2nd lieutenant, with the more red showing the lower rank. All squadrons had several non-commissioned officers, having the normal uniform and equipment of troopers, about 5 brigadiers, nowadays called corporals, and they were recognizable by the 2 white stripes on the lower arm. While there were 3 marshals de logis, nowadays called sergeants, and they wore a white upside-down sergeant arrow above the 2 white stripes on the left shoulder. Many of the brigadiers, or soldiers first class, serving more than 5 years, had a red arrow on the left shoulder. 1 red arrow standing for 5 years of service. Here you see a soldier first class, characterized by the single white stripe on the lower arm, with 1 red arrow showing 5 years of service. The highest officer in the regiment was the colonel, and he was recognizable, having 2 silver-laced epaulets of a higher officer on both shoulders. Similar to cuirassiers, the trumpeters of a regiment wore uniforms in the colors of their regiment, only in reverse coloration, meaning the green parts of the trooper's coat were now in regimental colors, while the regimental collar front, the neck collar and the cuffs were in green. This image shows a trumpeter of the 5th Regiment in scarlet colors. Many regiments had elite companies, made up of troopers that had distinguished themselves. The elite companies would show off their elite status by wearing red epaulets for troopers, in a similar fashion as elite regiments like cuirassiers or carabineers or Imperial Guard units. They also wore bearskin hats instead of dragoon helmets. The elite status made that elite dragoon troopers looked virtually similar to carabineers. Elite units with bearskins, similar carabines, and a long sword, only wearing blue coats similar to cuirassiers instead of the dragoon green. As carabineers were classed as heavy cavalry, they were likely mounted on larger horses, but for the rest they looked and were armed very similar. Napoleon must have liked and seen dragoons as the mainstay cavalry, creating so many regiments. When heading off in 1805 on his first campaign as emperor with the newly formed Grande Armée, he set off with 47 cavalry regiments, 2 carabinier regiments, 8 cuirassiers, making up the heavy cavalry, 6 hussar and 7 chasseurs au cheval regiments forming the light cavalry. The remaining 24 regiments, more than half, were dragoons, indicating that they were the backbone of the cavalry arm of the emperor in the upcoming campaign against the Austrians and the Russians around the fields of Austerlitz. But this is part of another story.